Welcome to a whirlwind journey back to the Roaring Twenties, an era that not only danced to the beat of jazz but also witnessed the birth of the modern consumer culture. Imagine a time when the star power of Babe Ruth, the daring of Al Capone, and the elegance of Coco Chanel weren't just shaping the headlines but were at the heart of a revolution transforming how we shop, dress, and indulge. Today we unravel the glitz and glam to reveal how these iconic figures, among others, sparked a consumer revolution that still echoes in our malls, screens, and lifestyles. We are joined by Jason Voiovich, author of Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, How Innovators of the Roaring Twenties Created the Consumer Revolution, which will be linked in the description below. Enjoy the episode. Jason, welcome to American History Gazette.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jake. Glad to be here.
I'm so excited for this episode because, like we talked about, I'm hugely fascinated with marketing and consumer culture. And all of this really started back in the 20s after the Industrial Revolution with the Consumer Revolution, which is such an important era in American history that still profoundly impacts us today, whether we realize it or not. A lot of people don't realize that. But before we get into all that, what inspired you to write this book?
It's funny. When I didn't start my career writing about consumer culture, even though I'm in marketing and product launch, and that's been my entire career. I had a project in 2020, kind of a pandemic project, like many people did, to write basically take the presidency of the United States, each president, not just the cool ones or the popular ones, but each president, and treat them as if they were the chief marketing officer of the United States. And how would I kind of re-examine history from that lens? I published it as a blog over that time, and then finally decided to create a book about it afterwards and kind of condense those into a book. But what really got me thinking about the 1920s was when I got to Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover specifically in that era. Each president I had talked to, you knew a little something about him, and it deepened my knowledge. But when I got to those three, what I realized was everything I thought I really knew about them was wrong. And I really didn't understand that era. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that how could I be in marketing, in consumer culture this long? How could I be a practicing marketing professional and not really understand where it all came from? And that was the genesis behind writing Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, is all the stories that came out of that I learned about, I wanted to put into a book so that people who might not ordinarily pick up a history book would take a look at this and say, got it. I understand my day-to-day life a little bit better. It's not really a lot about politics. It's not about big government or kind of government policy. It's all about the kind of decisions that you and I make, all of us make on a day-to-day basis. The choices we make were defined in the 1920s.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating era, and a lot of people see it as, the Roaring Twenties and the glitz and glamour of that era, the cocktail parties and the jazz, but it's so much more than that. There's so many things that we do today that were birthed from that era that we just don't even realize. But I'd like to set the stage for this discussion on consumer revolution. How would you characterize the society and culture of the Roaring Twenties at that time? Because I think that's important to note if we're going to look at the consumer revolution and how that impacted that society and culture.
I think what people struggle with a little bit, especially from the 2020s, is when we look back at history, we think of here's the metaphor that might be the best one to use. If I were to take you back in a time machine to 1924, 100 years ago, you would kind of get around. You'd be able to figure it out. You'd drive a car, you would go to a home in the suburbs, you'd have a mortgage, you would go to the grocery store, you would have put things in a refrigerator. All of the, you'd be on the radio, you'd pick up media. No, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have a lot of those things. But you'd be surprised at how similar everything was and how quickly you'd figure out your way in the world. It wouldn't really seem that different after you kind of got used to a few of the kind of the technical things. If I took you back just 10 years earlier, you'd be lost. Utterly, completely lost. We just did not have a society like that. Most people lived in rural areas. The people thought of themselves differently. And that was maybe the biggest change from a psychological perspective en masse, was when you had the Industrial Revolution in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, created this deluge of stuff that you could get. It kind of that mass production. Henry Ford and all those, like Edison, figured out how to bring you more stuff. The bankers during that time, during the 20s, figured out that stuff didn't really matter if you couldn't afford it. So they figured out how to give you payment plans, and how to, installment plans were birthed, really kind of grew up during that era, driven largely by the biggest expense most people had, which is either a home or an automobile. And then no one, if you could get it and you could afford it, wasn't a big deal if you didn't want it. And that was really the birth and kind of growth of mass marketing. But what none of those people and none of those innovators and the government didn't understand, no one really understand what really happened, which is people took those things and changed the way they thought about themselves. And it was really the birth of mass choice in the United States psyche, where people thought of themselves as choice makers, where you had all these options available to you, and you could choose where you wanted to live. You could choose where you wanted to work. You could, all these things that people weren't able to choose before. It's just so bizarre to people to go back and say, hey, if you were born in 1890, an Irish immigrant, you could be a cop or a priest. And there was just a path you went down as a human being, defined by your class, defined by your race, defined by your station in life, that although America was the land of opportunity and some people did find a way out of that, most people didn't. And it just wasn't, you just didn't have that number of choices. You couldn't really define your life. The 1920s put all of the choices in people's lap. And I think that most industrialists and governments, and you read about them, no one could figure out what the change that had happened. They just utterly did not understand that people thought of themselves differently and that they would not be controlled anymore. I mean, the biggest example of that, of course, is prohibition, but there's so many other examples of how we would not be told what to do any longer.
That's so interesting. I mean, you said that even 10 years earlier, we would have been so lost. And then 10 years later, we kind of would have been able to pick up on how to navigate ourselves in society. But I think that's just a testament to how much change there was in such a short amount of time. And you're right. I mean, you're kind of saying that there was a huge explosion in the amount of goods that were available, and they were much more readily available. But it was more so an identity shift of the American public. They saw themselves differently. They weren't restricted to this societal construct of, you grow up in this small rural town, you have 3 options on what to be. You meet a girl in that, like, the wife you're going to get lives in that small town. There was just an explosion of options and so much more freedom. And you make that distinction very clear when you talk about it was a consumer revolution, but it created choice makers. That's like the key phrase that you like to use. So I'd like to flesh that out a little bit more. How did the consumer revolution change not only what we buy and how we buy it? Like you mentioned, there's the financial institutions allowing payment plans and all that stuff, but how did it change how we saw ourselves in society and as choice makers with more freedom?
I think when most people think about consumer culture, we get hung up on the word consumer, and it limits our thinking. When you just go to the Wikipedia entries on consumer culture, and all you have to do is you just spend a couple minutes there, and mostly the area on consumer culture, the heading for that is anti-consumerism, and what they mean by that is that consumer culture is extractive. It messes with people psychologically, that people aren't happy because of the choices they make. And are those things untrue? Not necessarily, though that is a part of it. But what I like to think of it as, if we stop thinking about just the consumption of products and services, which is what they're really talking about, and thinking of, okay, well, how do we consume ideas? How do we consume entertainment? That we have a choice. If you were born in the, like, let's say you're in the Civil War, if you were born in a Republican family or a Democrat family, that's what you were. Like, you didn't get to choose your political identity. That just wasn't a thing. You didn't choose what newspapers you read. You chose the ones that the people around you read. You didn't have your own ideas about that. Certainly kind of a distinction about your own identity or how you wanted to present yourself, even how you dressed. Like, that wasn't something you really got to decide. You know, if you decided, well, I want to like guys, or I want to like girls, or I want to like both, or I want to be a different religion, you didn't make those choices. That just didn't happen. And there are always those privileged, wealthy people where, yes, you could point to an example of someone who did that. But I'm talking about for the rest of us, you know, the people who didn't, you know, kind of grow up with a silver spoon lodged up our ass. You know, this is the you know, the majority of people. So when I say choice makers, what I mean is, yes, we got to pick what kind of car we wanted. We also got to pick what newspaper we read, what clothes we bought, how we presented ourselves, who we chose to marry. Did we choose to have kids or not? I mean, this is the era people think about, like, birth control, for instance, as a product of the pill in the 1960s. It was not. Most birth control was popularized and brought into the market in the 1920s. It was the first time you could buy a diaphragm, you could buy a condom, you could buy these things on the market without going to jail. You know, before that point, if you wanted to get birth control in the mail, you could be charged under, under lewd conduct acts for, like, you know, shipping smut through the mail. Just crazy stuff that, like, we would just not tolerate today. But back then, that was how it was. So we gave people what I don't think people understand is we, through the course of marketing and finance and production, we gave people all of this choice, and we seem a little surprised that people took it and ran with it and decided kind of who they were going to be. That's really the output of this era. Is if you're right now thinking to yourself, well, I get to kind of go out and decide, like, do I want to attend that church or not? Do I want to vote for that person or not? Like, people think you didn't choose who you wanted to vote for when you were in kind of Tammany Hall in New York in that era. You didn't choose. You know, some boss told you who to vote for, and if he didn't, you're going to get your ass kicked outside the polling place. And luckily, if you did that, he'd ask you to go back in there and vote again. Maybe vote again, and maybe vote a third time just for good measure to make sure that you knew what your choice really was.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, and that's most definitely true. But like anything, there's pros and cons. So I'd like to play devil's advocate here. And I'm a huge film nerd, so I've been watching Yorgos Lanthimos' filmography recently, and he's a brilliant filmmaker, but he plays with the theme of kind of escaping one societal construct just to be trapped in another. And I think that's such a fascinating theme that's applicable here, because with the consumer revolution, America escaped the societal construct of kind of being born into your identity and being told what you had to do with that choice and with that freedom. But that came at a cost, because we talk about marketing, the mass marketing. You're free to make your choices, but you're also being told what choices to make because of marketing. And we see that a lot today, especially with social media. People's ideas and their opinions and their beliefs are kind of shaped by what they see online. And also, because there was so much more goods available, it kind of birthed this materialistic need for instant gratification and always needing new and fancy things. So we did escape the societal construct of being born into our identity and not really having options and freedom, but just to be kind of trapped in another of this mass marketing, materialistic society. What would you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that a couple of things come up. One is an economist would tell you there are no costless trade-offs. That all economic decisions, all constructs, all paradigms that you operate in society have costs and they have benefits. And it's a matter of really how you judge that is en masse, on net, which one leads to, which one leads to the most productive outcome, whether, and however you measure that, whether that's, you measure it with GDP, you measure it with happiness, you measure it with whatever metric you want. I would say very specifically, and I bring this up in the conclusion of the book to kind of give people something to think about, that, and it speaks to exactly what you're talking about, Jake, is people may have read the book, and they may be thinking this book in their head right now. Barry Schwartz wrote The Paradox of Choice. And his book talks about how more choice does not necessarily lead to more happiness, and empirically tested it. And what he meant was that, let's say, it's easiest to understand with an example. Let's say you're going in, and you may not be able to see this, but I can because I'm looking at Jake right now. He is wearing a very snappy tie. And you might be listening, but he's wearing a very, very snappy tie. Now, let's say Jake walks into a haberdashery, kind of what used to be called a men's clothing store, and he says, I want to buy a new tie. And he walks in, and there against the wall are thousands, literally thousands of new ties. And he struggles to pick one, and you come away with one. Do you really feel happy about the choice you made? And what Barry Schwartz found in his research was no, not necessarily. And the reason he doesn't is, even though that might have been the best possible tie ever in the history of the universe for Jake at that moment, there were 999 other choices he did not make. And he had what Barry Schwartz did not call, by the way, he had FOMO. He had fear of missing out. Like, he was unhappy about the choices he did not make. So what happens is, in that kind of retail example, what retailers have figured out, by the way, is don't show Jake 1,000 ties. Show Jake 3 ties. Bring him a few to choose from and say, hey, here are 3 that I think could work for you. Here are the pros and cons of each one. Because with a few choices, we can feel good about the selection we made. With 1,000 choices, we don't. And that's part of how, when you think, well, are people happy with Amazon? No, they're not. And part of the reason they're not, and when you actually test people, and they like certain things about it, but when you really kind of dig underneath, what they're really unhappy with is that they have too much choice, and they're overwhelmed, and they're unhappy that they can't choose that. It's why more of these algorithms have figured out, like you mentioned on social media, but commerce algorithms do this all the time. They are trying to figure out, if I try to show you 1,000 things, you're probably not going to buy anything. But if I can curate a list of a few things, you're probably a lot more likely to do that. It's actually one of the strongest use cases for AI right now, is in commerce, to try to figure out a better way to make you happier about a choice selection that you want to make. And we can argue, can't we, that is that really choice? If you are being fed, there's a wonderful article. I can't remember where it was. Was it Gawker? I can't remember exactly where it was, but it described how conspiracy theories work. And conspiracy theories don't work by kind of giving you all the information, right? They give you little breadcrumbs along the way. So you feel like you are making choices and you are discovering things along the way. And that's how they are so psychologically powerful, is you think you figured it out yourself. You think you're making a set of choices yourself, but are you really? How are those choices being curated for you? So it's tough, on one hand, kind of speaking economically, on one hand, we recognize all of that. We know that we're not as happy as we want to be. We know that our choices are being curated for us. On the other hand, what's the alternative? That's it can be a very tricky balance, right? To say, well, we need our choices limited. Okay, by who? With what agenda? And are we going, I don't know a lot of people who want to have their choices limited, especially when, most people, well, let me correct that. Most people are pretty happy limiting their choices if they agree with the limiter, and they agree with that. But they don't agree when it's someone else. They like someone deciding what you could buy or what you could do until it's choices that you don't agree with. And then you want to have your choice back. So this is not it's not easy to think through. I think it's, in the book, I go through, 26 different stories, and each one is a little bit of a, how do you think about it? Because there is no easy answer here. And I think that's a quality of some of the best history books is they don't give you answers. They give you a lot to think about. That was a long answer, Jake. We even took you to the store.
Yeah, no, it was a phenomenal answer, but it's so true. It's such a consumerism is so complicated and intricate, and I think what we're talking about here is the dark side of consumer culture. You mentioned the tie store and the choices. Choices are great, but too many choices are overwhelming, and you mentioned that FOMO, and I think this has led to a vast problem within, the public of this void of unhappiness in their heart that can't be filled because people constantly need external factors in order to fulfill their happiness, and they constantly feel this void within themselves that they need to fill with external factors. And I think that is because of the consumer culture and the amount of choices we have. And you talk about how companies are kind of figuring this out. We see this a lot with targeted ads. I mean, I'm sure everyone's experienced it where they're talking about something with their friend and the next day they see an ad for that on Instagram. It's kind of crazy, and it's kind of scary how corporations are figuring this out and doing this with algorithms and AI.
I think that there is certainly a kind of there is a dark side to it. There is no question about that. There is a dystopian sort of way to look at that. I might argue that any cultural construct driven to an extreme will degenerate. And when you look at those cultural constructs that are no longer serving people, they tend to be ready to be replaced by something else. That doesn't mean that the new thing will be better, but it will be different. I would say, though, on that front, when I find choice culture generally, I think one of the reasons it's been so resilient over the past 100 years is that it is generally self-correcting. And here's what I mean by that. And the first example we had of that was in the 1920s with Prohibition. As most of your listeners will know, Prohibition was signed on, it was in effect throughout the entire decade and into the 1930s, early 1930s, and essentially limited what people could, limited a major choice that people had that was deeply ingrained in American culture before that time. Having, in the American Revolution specifically, rum and spirits were a big part of that. Beer was a big part of the German immigrant experience. So when you think about, what we were trying to do with social engineering during the 1920s was profound. And what the central planners in the United States, both Democrat and Republican, by the way, this is the progressive era, what they failed to understand was the cultural change happening at that time. That people would not be denied. They would choose to do it differently, and there's just no way to enforce, when people en masse decide to violate a law, there is no governmental authority that can stop that. And I think what most smart politicians and planners and corporations learned from Prohibition was there is a balance. There's a new balancing power factor. If you thought about, before the 1920s, you really had government, business as maybe the two, government and commerce as maybe the two big driving factors. Now, what the people thought was never nothing, but they were somehow less. They were to be manipulated, to be told what to do, to be guided. That was a very common theme. If you read progressive literature, what they really talk about is kind of hey, we're smarter than the masses of people, and we're going to guide you into doing that. And that's common up until that era, by the way. That is a common thought, and I would argue a common feature of progressive thought today, by the way, is that we know better, you don't know enough, and we need to decide for you. But what smart policymakers and corporations learned from Prohibition was that consumers en masse would choose, and frankly, they were the bigger power, and they were more important than any of the other two, and they could decide what they were going to do. They didn't have total power, but neither did the government, neither did business. And what people struggle with, I think, is that they say, well, the government controls what we do, or the corporations control what we do. Well, in some cases, that's true. Consumers also control what the government does. Consumers also control what business does. It is a balancing act that tends to shift in different directions over time, but tends to self-balance, because if it gets too far off kilter, consumers tend to bring it back, and consumers will not comply. And we've seen this again and again and again, and there's lots of moralizing that goes along with it, but consumers not complying is something that tends to correct overreach, both government overreach and corporate overreach. We tend to think, one example I will give that's a little bit more modern, we're not going to talk about COVID. We're just not going to talk about that. Okay? Anyone listening, we're not going to talk about it. Don't think we're going to talk about it. Don't email me about this. I don't want to hear it. I'll use a different example. In the 1950s, we think, okay, how long we all think that big companies have all this power over us? Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, they have all this power and it can never go away. Got it? If 50 years ago, or the 1960s, it was common for a Fortune 500 company to stay on like the S&P 500 for 30, 40 years. Can't remember the exact stat. Today, it's about 17 years. By 2030, it might be 5 years. So when you interpret that differently, what you learn is consumers are driving companies out of business faster than they ever have before. Consumers are actually way more powerful en masse than we give them credit for. And you just have to look at people stopping using Facebook, for instance. Or, how powerful was Microsoft only 20 years ago? Like that it was antitrust, it was a big thing. It was on Internet Explorer, was on everything. It was just unstoppable. Every computer on the world ran on Microsoft. They were the forever company. We'd never be rid of them. Are they nothing today? No. Microsoft is still a successful organization. Are they as dominant as they were? No, not even close. So by 2030, if trends hold, those companies that I mentioned either won't be in business anymore or will be not dominant anymore in any sense. It happens faster than you think, and what happens to them? We put them out of business. Simple as that. We just make different choices and they go away. So if we want to, make different choices, how quickly will the change happen to electric vehicles, for instance? Probably quicker than most people think. Because within 10 years, we went from a horse-centric society to a car-centric society in 10 years. That's way bigger than transitioning to electric vehicles. Way bigger than that. So things can happen a lot faster than people think. So I'm not saying that we don't have a point, that consumer culture can have a real dark side and has a lot of trouble. But there's an upside too, and I think the power balance is one of consumer culture's real legacies. and real positive impact on the world.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Power balance is, I think, a good term. People don't, consumers don't realize how much power they actually have, and the 20s kind of was the dawn of consumers and the American public having a voice, because you mentioned earlier, before it was business and government the driving factors of America. And after the consumer revolution, people had power over these companies. They had the power of choice, which could mean that a company could blow up and severely, succeed and kind of have an exponential growth because of whatever factors, marketing a good product. But also on the flip side, it could mean the demise of other companies because a competitor arises that has a better product or a cheaper product. But early in your answer, you mentioned that extremes degenerate. And forgive me for sidetracking, but I don't know how involved you are in politics, and I don't need to ask about your political affiliation. But it brought up an interesting thought in my head that we see today with politics is both sides of the spectrum, the left and the right, have like gone so far extreme to the left and to the right that I'm curious, do you think that that philosophy of extremes degenerate, do you think that's applicable to what we see in politics right now?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that the political system uh, isn't a free market, which is, and if free markets aren't free markets either, there's no what you might call Austrian or libertarian ideal there. Free markets don't exist, and there's a good case to be made that they probably shouldn't, and it would be too difficult to have that. We kind of learned that with the Silk Road, didn't we? But with politics, we have seen, my first book, Marketer in Chief, covered such a wide span of history that we've seen extreme polarization before. Multiple times, and you think, well, the last time we had that, we had the Civil War. Not necessarily. There was plenty of extreme polarization in politics in multiple eras, and those who study this sort of thing see multiple political eras in American history. Your kind of founding era, your Jacksonian era, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, kind of the robber baron era, the progressive era, post-World War II. They see multiple eras, and what ends up happening is the political ground realigns and shifts. That extreme polarization is not a stable situation, so it will tend to crack under its own pressure, and one will kind of take over the other, or something new will emerge. We've seen that multiple times. The kind of the robber baron era cracked and it became the progressive era. And that lasted quite a long time. We had more of that, kind of the Reagan Revolution fizzled out. We had lots of different examples where I think the best thing I can say for people who are like, oh my God, this is so bad, this has never happened before, they're so disheartened, that the corny analogy of it's always darkest before the dawn is just about right. That when things are typically at their worst, the dam tends to break. Now, we've only had one time where that got bad, where we had a situation with armed conflict. I tend to disagree with those folks who tend to see us on the brink of another conflict of that type. We just don't have the dynamics. People think history repeats itself. History does not repeat itself. History rhymes. So there can be things that there may be conflict, but will it be the same type of conflict? Unlikely. It's unlikely we're going to have a bunch of dudes in blue coats and a bunch of dudes in gray coats, up against, kind of, in battle formations somewhere in Tennessee. That isn't going to happen. It's a very different sort of thing. Today we have a different dynamic. We don't have a north-south divide in the same way. We have a very, very different situation. So I see it's much more likely, if history is any judge, that we will something new will emerge. What that is exactly, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like right now. I think anyone who tells you that is either lying or trying to sell you something.
No, I would have to completely agree with you. I thought it was an interesting point to bring up, but I definitely have a hopeful outlook on America. I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of the cynical outview that we're doomed and there's going to be a civil war and all that. I tend to be very hopeful. I think we have seen this sort of division and political unrest before. Like you said, history rhymes. Great quote, by the way. Very quotable. You should coin that term. History doesn't repeat itself.
I think I stole it from someone else.
Well, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes is such a good quote. But I think we're seeing that today. There has been political divide and unrest before, and I think, especially when it comes to politics, it's an ever evolving institution, and like you said, new systems will arise. But going back to the book, Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, I'd like to dive deep into that title for a minute. So, Booze, you're referring to three prominent characters of the Roaring Twenties and the Consumer Revolution. Booze being Al Capone, Babe is obviously Babe Ruth, and the Little Black Dress is Coco Chanel. All three played significant roles in shaping consumerism of the 20s. But I'd like to flesh them out one at a time and kind of talk about their impact on the consumer revolution. So we'll start with Al Capone. What was his impact on the consumer revolution?
I think Al Capone is, he has such wonderful. You think I'm a quotable guy? He was a quotable guy, and he was a bad man, by the way. He was a mob boss. Let's not be amoral about it. He was a bad dude, but we can appreciate what he had to contend with. And most people think about when they kind of read about the mobs and bootlegging that people were getting sick from wood alcohol and that it was bad and that people were getting killed all the time. And yeah, people got whacked. That was part of the deal. But think about this for a second. Don't think about the mobs or the Elliot Nesses or all that sort of thing. Think about the average Joe or the average Jane who kind of wanted to go have a drink. Think about what they had to go through to do that. If you were caught in a sting at a speakeasy, you could go to jail. Let me say that again. Like, you could be prosecuted under the Volstead Act and could face significant, financial. You could lose your freedom. People wanted to drink and wanted to have a good time, that they were willing to risk their freedom to do it. Like, that is a big deal that I don't think gets talked about enough. And most people did. It wasn't. Yeah, there were people who, wouldn't drink and who followed the law, but we created that. On one side, you could say we created a nation of lawbreakers. No, we created a nation of choice makers who said we're not going to follow a bad law. So you've got people willing to risk your freedom. Are they going to go drink and wood alcohol? Are they gonna tolerate kind of crappy service, bad kind of dingy places? Not at all. People forget these speakeasies were beautiful places. You can go and you can see restored ones today, and they're just fantastic places. They're wonderful places, but people needed a front to go. It wasn't just like you knocked on a door and you walked in. There were a few of those. Most of them were little rooms behind a jazz club, for instance, where some of the biggest jazz stars, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald. I mean, you name the names. They all started at speakeasies paid by mobsters and bootleggers, who brought that kind of culture, to America. It was America's classical music, birthed rock and roll, birthed, hip hop, you name it. It all lends itself back to that era. So what Al Capone had to figure out was, I got competition. I mean, people are risking their freedom, and they will not choose to come back to my speakeasy if they don't have a good experience, if they're not entertained, they don't like my booze, if it's watered down, they're not coming. So he had to make sure that he created an outstanding experience. So Before Prohibition, it was just dudes going to saloons. And, you wanted to go to the bathroom, you went out back and there was a tree. Well, now that it wasn't just men going to speakeasies, women were going as well. No woman wants to go out back and say, yeah, go squat over a tree trunk back there. No one's going to do that. Women didn't want to do that. Al Capone and his group created the first powder rooms for women. Improve the bathroom experience. So if you enjoy the bathroom experience at your local restaurant, thank Al Capone. He's the one who had to figure that out. So I think it's important to understand there were a lot of, he transformed not just the kind of the experience of going to a club, but essentially created the club going experience, created that entertainment experience for people. Because if you were going to go and risk arrest, it better be a good time.
That is fascinating. The consumer revolution didn't just bring about the amount of goods on the market and the availability of them, but it also birthed experiences. You could go out and do cool things, go to the speakeasies and have a good time. And it's so fascinating that the mob was kind of behind that, and that whole new revolution of experiences and the amount of things you could go out on the town and do. And I think people don't really realize, the mafia has been glorified by the movies, Goodfellas and The Godfather. And I'm Italian. I love those movies. Goodfellas is my favorite movie. But it's crazy to think how much the mafia and the mob actually built modern America. It's people don't really realize where these small inventions came from, like the bathroom experience and the powder room came from Al Capone. I know that the mafia in New York had a lot to do with the construction in New York City. They were kind of behind that all. So I definitely want to do an episode one day with an expert on the mafia and kind of dive deep in how the mafia actually did help build modern America. It's fascinating, and I don't think many people realize how impactful and influential they were in building modern America. But our next character is Babe Ruth. So what did he have to do with the consumer revolution?
Well, speaking of experiences, when you think about sports, and especially baseball before the 1920s, sports just weren't a big deal. People have a lot of trouble understanding that no one gave two flips really what happened. Yeah, we had the Black Sox scandal and we had some of those. But when you thought about where was sports in popular culture before the 1920s? Nowhere. Most people lived in rural areas. You lived apart from people. Yeah, there were some of those teams but sports wasn't an industry. Sports was, and all you have to do is look at what they were paid back then. All those guys had to have other jobs. Just to be clear, it was kind of, they weren't even, it was a hobby. It was just you even look at the amount of physical training they did. Hey, come on. I mean, a high school baseball team could have kicked the Yankees' ass back in those days. They are just so much better. They are so much more sophisticated now. It is very different back then. But Babe Ruth was the first person who created kind of a sports brand. He was quotable. He was something that, people who never saw him play could still could kind of get into this drama and this story around the game. That the baseball game wasn't just a game; it was an experience. It had a storyline. It had a narrative, and what really kind of propelled Babe Ruth wasn't just that. It was just at the same time, baseball was being put on the radio because the radio needed a way to make money because the radio had no way to make money. In the early 1920s, it was a science project. But people had to fill time on the radio, and that seems obvious to us now, but it was not then. The baseball game's 3 hours long. We might as well put it on the radio because it fills a lot of time that we're struggling with. But if you've ever listened to radio, baseball on the radio, it is actually a great experience today, but think about it if you didn't have color commentary. Think about just a play-by-play listening to baseball. That's boring as snot. What radio announcers figured out at that time is that between the plays, because there's a lot of dead time in baseball, they would fill that time with stories about the players and what was going on and who's coming up to the plate and what's the drama of the game and the drama of the players. And guess who was a huge storyline? Babe Ruth. He just the timing of those two things coming together. Radio made Babe Ruth. Radio made baseball. And Babe Ruth and radio made modern sports. So when we think about, like, before, if you were into baseball, you probably played baseball. After that, you could be a fan of a baseball team without ever picking up a bat. You know, it was like, how many people who are fans of whatever your, American football team is, how many people have ever actually put on the pads? A tiny percentage, maybe 5% of people who are fans, will go and see the Chiefs who have ever actually played the game. But it's a big deal. It is a huge industry in the United States. Sports is one of our biggest. It's one of our biggest cultural exports. Sports and everything that goes along with sports, the game, the teamwork, all of those things that have kind of injected themselves into all other aspects of our culture, came from that era. Came from primarily from radio and Babe Ruth.
That's incredibly fascinating. I mean, sports today is so massive. We can't even imagine a time when sports was kind of irrelevant. Sports is probably the biggest, thing to talk about when it comes to small talk. You imagine small talk, especially amongst dudes. Like, it's always like, oh, did you see the game last night? Like, that is the small talk topic, is sports. I mean, it's massive. It's global. And again, we have the 1920s to thank for that, which is remarkable. There's so many things that we have the 1920s to thank for. It's incredible. But our last character in your book, the little black dress, which refers to Coco Chanel, of course. So what role did Coco Chanel have in the consumer revolution?
Coco Chanel is a fascinating woman. And there's so many great biographies on her. And my only regret in my book is that I could only give her one chapter. She finds her way into lots of others. By the way, how could she not? But her idea was, if you think about clothing before the 1920s, and this is that time machine example is just apropos. Go back before the 1920s. How did women dress? Like, it was a multi-step, multi-layer sort of affair. And, women sort of know this intuitively. For guys, you just have no concept of what it was like to put on a corset, put on a crinoline, put on multiple layers, and the hair. It could easily take you a couple hours to get fully dressed for a night out. Easily could take that time, and they were restrictive. You couldn't really move. You could barely fit through anything. Think about going to the baseball game to see Babe Ruth play. Think about going through a turnstile. There's no way you can do it. It limited so much about what women could do just by nature of how they had to dress to go out. Coco Chanel thought, you know what, I'm going to have a different sense of style for women. It's going to be simple. It's going to be free. It's going to be short. The materials aren't going to be silks and these kind of fancy materials. The material for the very first little black dress and a lot of her fashions were made, and the material was the same material that French officers' underwear was made out. And if you think, like, how on earth did Coco Chanel how did she know what French male officers' underwear material was like? I'll leave that to the imagination. She liked men, she liked women, she liked anything. She was a very promiscuous, very free, very empowered person, with a great backstory, great entrepreneur. But she really, she created fashion as not just a what you wore and what you looked like. It's how you presented yourself. Because through your clothing choices, Nick, before you dressed with, hey, how your mom dressed. That's how you dressed, and she probably gave her clothes to you. But now you could pick a dress. You could pick costume jewelry, which she also helped popularize, like jewelry that didn't cost a year's wages. So you could wear jewelry. You could wear hats. You had shorter hair that was easier to take care of. simpler makeup that was cheaper about that time. And so when you went to the jazz club and you wanted to kind of dance, if you've seen videos from that time, women dancing the Charleston, how could you do that in one of those big crinoline gowns? There's no way. You needed one of Coco Chanel's dresses because you were moving. And women of that time wanted to kind of be out with the guys. The guys wanted to be out with the women. There was a lot more touching and more going on at that time. See previous comment regarding birth control. All of those things were happening about that time. And Coco Chanel was the one that was person most probably singularly responsible for freeing women. Probably did more. There's an old saying that, what did more to free women? The suffrage amendment or Coco Chanel? And most people would make the argument that Coco Chanel did more at a practical level to empower women than the voting amendment did. Although both were critical, it was on a, the voting amendment gave women political power. Coco Chanel gave women real choice and real power, and started along that path. There are lots of other great stories of other just amazing women in the book who, created the modern home, created the Better Homes and Gardens, Better Homes of America. Model homes, if you've ever been to a model home, it was created by, Myrna Maloney in the 1920s. They figured out how to, how to do that and how to change the role women played in society. Changed also during that time. Massive change during the 1920s. Most people especially most men I talk to, have no real sense of what first wave feminism was like. But first wave feminism happened at the same time as all these other things we've been talking about. Think about the amount of change, and then we think like, well, in our lifetime we had the internet. BFD. Really. Not that, comparatively, not that important.
Yeah, that's incredible. Coco Chanel is absolutely instrumental in, feminism and liberating women from constructs. That's crazy, but I think it's also a testament to what we talked about earlier, that the consumer revolution also led to an identity shift. People saw themselves differently. You talked earlier that it wasn't just about what you were wearing, it's how you present yourself. I like to say the suit doesn't make the man makes the suit. It's all about how you present yourself. And it's not just the goods and the marketing that kind of birthed this era. I mean, this is a theme you see all over human existence, but it's people who bring about change. It's important people who are willing to step outside the boundaries of society and, chase their dreams and take risks and not care what people think. And those are the people who end up changing the world, kind of like the Steve Jobs, the Elon Musks. Those are the people who push society further, which it's absolutely a testament to that era. But I'd like to get into, I heard a quote that you said, like you said, you're a quotable guy. So I heard another quote that you said, and it was very profound to me. You said, "You may not be interested in the 1920s, but the 1920s are interested in you." And that is so profound. It's talking about, today and understanding the history of consumerism so that we can make better decisions and have, better consumer behavior. But I'd just like to ask you, what do you mean by that quote?
I think that when I talk with a lot of people in politics and marketing, about that, and they go down a very similar path that, like, hey, our decisions are being, government is overreaching, corporations are overreaching. We have climate change. We don't have social justice. We don't have these things that we want. And there are all these things that people talk about. And what I try to remind them is that you can fix all that. You could decide today that all of those things are worth having and that you are going to do them. And if enough people do, they will make it happen. That's really the core lesson of the 1920s. That and one really specific example of that, when people think like, well, what kind of power do consumers have? Like how are consumers demonstrating their power in a really tangible way? What else was founded during the 1920s? Consumer Reports. That particular publication and the people who founded it, there's a whole other story there. Very, Soviet communist. But the whole idea was that, okay, the whole idea behind Consumer Reports and Consumers Union and that entire movement was and still is to give people the information they need to make better and informed choices. And objective, scientific, rigorous information to help people compare things, kind of apples to apples. It was a very specific way, that team looked out and said, we have too many things, marketing is out of control, we have too many products, the quality is all over the place. We need some way for consumers to have a place where they can kind of exercise their power and consumers can help other consumers. We see that happen all the time. When social media becomes too polarized, too weird, where are people going? They're going to Reddit. They're going to other places where they can kind of escape that and they can talk to each other person to person. I can give you the real scoop on what's happening with this or what's happening with that. Now, is that perfect? Is that ideal all the time? No, not necessarily, but we see that same kind of psychology, and it's really the mindset shift that was most important, that you're not a victim. Like there's certain areas where you might not have as much power as you might like, but ultimately the reason that consumer culture has proved so resilient, not only is it self-limiting and self-correcting, but ultimately it changes that self-perception that, you can improve where you're at. You can change things. And there are people who debate that and people who fight against that. That particular perspective does not tend to hold much water for very long, because people do realize, like, oh, wait, if I really feel that buying an electric car will help climate change or whatever you decide to do, or I want to achieve a racial justice in my area, you can go make that choice. You can go out and you can take concrete action that will do that. You can go buy an electric car. You can hire someone who is who's underprivileged. You can decide to do that if you want to do that. And people do. When they decide that that's something they want to change, they tend to change it over time. It's messy. It's not as fast as we might like sometimes, but what is the old saying of the arc of history bends towards justice? Arc of history bends towards choice, and it has over the last 100 years. And it's really the theme of the book is you have way more power than you think you do, and you should learn how to use it. That's the theme, is that don't let other people make those choices for you. Learn how to use your own power. That's what you want. And choice is the biggest power you have. But most people don't understand where it came from. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand how powerful they are just by the choices they make. Even if they don't have very many means. They think, well, I'm not wealthy. I can't make that many choices. You sure can. You can make choices on what media you consume, what ideas you believe. Those are powerful choices to make. And through your choices, you'll change the world.
Wow, that is so profound. You're preaching to the choir on that, because one of my favorite words is intentionality. I like to live my life intentionally. All my decisions and choices that I make, I like to be intentional. And I think it's such a testament, basically your entire answer is such a testament to why it's important to study history and understand the history of consumerism, because you won't fall into the traps of, the mass marketing, and you'll make much more informed and intentional decisions with your shopping or whatever. And I think that's such a beautiful theme to your book, that consumers are way more powerful than you realize, and your choices do matter, and you do have a choice. And you're right, it's messy, it takes work, it takes a lot of self-work, it takes a lot of self-reflection, but it's ultimately worth it. And I think it leads to a much better society and much more happiness when you put in the work to become aware about an issue, and you put in the work to take action, intentional action. I think that always leads to a net benefit for society. But I'd like to get into now some of we've talked about the service, or the experiences, and maybe the services that have come out of the consumer revolution. But I'd like to talk about some of the infamous goods that people may not realize have come out of the consumer revolution. I know that frozen foods is a big one that you've talked about. So can you just name some of the goods that people may not realize actually came out of the consumer revolution of the 20s?
Oh gosh, there's so many. There's some fun ones. Frozen food. If you want to pick up Kurlansky's book on a very curious man, talks about Clarence Birdseye and how he figured out how to flash freeze food and learned it from the Inuit in Labrador, Canada. Just a fantastic story. It's a wonderful one. You can get a Crib Notes version of it in my book, but it's worth more. It's worth deeper reading. There's some other fun ones. I think another one that most people don't realize is if does anyone have a speedboat? Does anyone have kind of a hacker craft, that kind of boat? Those were the original rum runners. And what was interesting about those boats is during Prohibition, you needed to keep your big tankers of booze that came from the Caribbean or Europe. You needed to keep them 3 miles, at least in the beginning, 3 miles offshore. So you couldn't bring it. They were totally legal out there, but you needed to get that booze to land. So they had these kind of smaller, faster boats. And the Coast Guard of that time, kind of really the beginnings of the modern Coast Guard, they said, well, we're going to put out a request for bid for a boat manufacturer to build us something, a clipper that can catch these guys. There's just no way. They're lumbering around in these big boats. There's just no way. They're just they're just sailing around them. So they put out the bid, and they got a faster boat. The rum runners looked at that and said, well, what do you know about government requests for bid? They're public. Guess what happened next? Can you guess what happened next? Of course you can guess what happened next. They went to the same boat manufacturers and said, I know what you're building for these guys, for the government. I will pay you to build a faster model. And they essentially built the very first modern speedboats. And the whole idea was outrunning the Coast Guard on the open seas. And you can still find these boats, like rich guys. It's kind of a rich guy, like trust fund baby kind of hobby now, which, with hackercraft. And those kind of very beautiful boats are about 18, 20 feet long. They're beautiful mahogany and wood. And with really big, long holds, there's kind of a place for a couple people to sit, but they look a little funny because when you look at them, you're like, well, that's weird. There's this big area that's just kind of underneath there that, like, what do you put down there? Booze is what you put down there. That's exactly what you put down there. So that's a fun one that most people forget. I would say a couple other fun ones. Time magazine was a fun one. The very first magazine that was basically the modern commentary. Like, that wasn't news, it was commentary. Now today, when you read the New York Times, you read Fox News, you read whatever you want to read, whatever your poison is, it's actually 80% commentary today and 20% news. Back in the day, though, it was all news, and people had a lot of trouble making sense of their world because it was so complicated. There's so much stuff coming at them. Like, that sound familiar? Time magazine was the very first place that basically was a weekly digest that kind of made sense of things for you. They kind of told you what to think about things. Just a wonderful kind of, people think, well, how did, you know, like we have so much more information than they did then. Not necessarily. We're still humans. We're the same. We're the same kind of, kind of hairless monkeys we've ever been. Our brain capacity has not changed much since then. We might have a lot more, but kind of the input is not any bigger than it was. Time magazine was the first one to figure out how to do that. First time we completed Route 66, the first real credit unions as alternatives to banks, the first time we marketed to kids on purpose. Marketed toys to kids, and we figured out that toy manufacturers, by the way, and I'll leave you with this, that toy manufacturers thought, oh, kids are just kind of like simple adults, and they can be manipulated, and they can be told what to do, and they will buy whatever we tell them to buy. And what marketers figured out really quickly was that kids were way harder to influence than their parents. And that children of the 1920s were better consumers than their parents for what should be an obvious reason. If you're a parent in the 1920s, you were not born during the consumer revolution. You were born before then. Your worldview was crystallized before that time. So when you think about, kids had no preconception that they were not a choice maker. Like, they were there to decide, and that they had all these options in front of them. They had no other understanding of the world. They learned, it's kind of like learning another language as a kid is a lot easier than learning as an adult. Consumer culture, choice culture was another language, and they were born with it. So it not surprising at all that kids of the 1920s were much better choice makers than their parents. Generally, they were much better and more savvy consumers, and they took that mindset into the Great Depression. And that's what most people don't realize, and that's kind of the follow-up book that I'm working on, is consumer choice during the Great Depression, because most people thought, that's the time when, we had to kind of all take a step back and let FDR and everything save us. The reality of the situation is that all those kids who learned how to make choices weren't going to all of a sudden stop, and they didn't. And they took that, and that's one of the key ways that people not only survived, but many people thrived and worked during the Great Depression, was that same mindset that there are choices, they're just different choices now. And what's the old saying? I think it was Warren Buffett who said, or was it his God rest his soul, his business partner, said, Charlie Munger said, when the tide goes out, you know who is swimming naked? So choices during the Great Depression, if you really understood what things were important to people during the Great Depression, when you look at, I have much lower means and things are stressed, you really learn what's important to people. And that same perspective persisted into the 1930s. It did not go away. It did not go away in World War II. It was so transformative that we just don't think about it. We kind of skip over it. Most studies of consumer culture, where do they start? The 1950s, kind of post-war, suburbia, Sears, all of that. Sears was founded in the 1890s. Sears opened the first big box stores in the 1920s. The first suburban big box store was a Sears in Chicago. That's the first time when you thought, I'm going to go to Walmart or Target today, and I'm going to, I'm going to walk around this big store. That was not their idea. That was Sears' idea, and that's why Sears became it wasn't the catalog. It was that store concept that took Sears from a powerful retailer to a dominant force in American life for 5 decades. So that's a long answer to a short question. There's so many things. I'm skipping over probably 20 or 30 of them.
Yeah, there's so many parallels from the 20s to today. You make a great point about the kids of, the 20s generation and how they were better choice makers than their parents because they grew up in a world where they had choice, they had freedom. They didn't know what it meant to not have that choice. And I think that's very prevalent to what we see today with especially my generation with technology and iPhones and iPads. We were born into that era and our parents don't understand. I'm not a big fan of staring at a screen all day. I'm a huge proponent of going outside and being active, but you see a lot of parents I think getting frustrated with their kids for using technology, but that's all they know. They were born into that. It's the same thing with the 20s because whatever you're born into, that's all you know. You can't understand, especially as a kid, you can't understand, the point your parents are trying to make, how they were born in a different time.
No, it's really interesting to watch, the primary sources of that era with advertising to kids and what kids actually thought, and what they wrote and what they told interviewers that, you know, they they could evaluate advertising claims better than their parents could. They could say that's not true, or that's just, I'm not really going to get that when I buy that product, or kind of join that. They for instance, one really specific example, during that era they wanted to, the banks wanted to kind of teach new bankers, new bank customers, and they would create these savings accounts for kids, and they would try to kind of indoctrinate them into this new era. Kids did the math and said, nah, not going to do that. Those things don't make sense. You're not paying me enough interest. They figured all that out really fast and said, you know what? They wanted, it was kind of a moralistic play, like, hey, you save up, you get that bike. They're like, I can buy that bike on an installment plan. Why would I go back to this kind of Benjamin Franklin era kind of thrift culture sort of thing when, you know what, for 10 easy payments of my lunch money, I can have that bike. And they figured it out really fast, and it drove a lot of the kind of the powers that be at that era nuts. The problem was, though, that their parents learned the same thing. How could you, as a mom or dad who is buying their car on an installment plan, which was the GMAC was created during the 20s, that allowed people to buy on installments, how could you then go to your kid and say you can't have that bike? You have to save up for that bike. You need to do all that. But we can go buy that house or that car on installments or on a balloon payment. Kids watch what we do. They don't listen to what we say. And anyone who's a parent understands that intuitively. The 20s were the first time that happened with money and with consumer choice. Kids had more choices than they ever had before, and they learned how to make them.
Yeah, monkey see, monkey do. Kids are a lot smarter than I think we realize because they're much more intuitive and I think in touch with their instincts because they haven't been conformed by society. But last question, but this is something I'm very passionate about, is making choices and buying goods that align with my values. I like to buy as much, food and produce from local farms. I like to support small businesses as much as I can. So why do you think it's important to be informed about our choices and make choices that align with our values?
I think it's all a matter of understanding and exercising your power. There are a number of different traditions that talk about this. You don't need a religious tradition to kind of understand it. Christians in your audience will understand the parable of the talents, where you have been gifted power, and if you choose not to use it, that's on you, and that is not rewarded. And there's a similar, Jewish tradition, there's a similar Islamic tradition, there's a similar, Buddhist tradition, that you have a responsibility to learn about your power, learn about the gift that has been granted to you, in whatever capacity it has been, so that you can improve it, enhance it, make better choices. So in your case, okay, I want to, I'm making a choice to buy from kind of local farmers. Got it. Why? Why is that? What is it? It impels you to learn more about the agricultural system. It impels you to learn more about the people who are growing your food, where your food comes from, makes more intentional choices about what you put in your body. Think about the responsibility that is. That's something that people don't think about. We've talked a lot about power. As the guy in Underoos says, with great power comes great responsibility. Actually, it was Ben or Aunt May, it depends on which version of that comic book you pick. But your power comes with a lot of responsibility. And that's, I think, where people sometimes enjoy being victims or adopting that mentality, is it's a little bit of a way to absolve yourself. Like, well, if the government or the big corporations are telling me what to do, what can I possibly do? I don't have any power, and I'm just going to kind of sit back and take it. Because I think people intuitively know they do have power. They see it all around them. They can make these choices. But in order to make a good one, you need to learn about the impact of that choice. You need to really understand it. If you want a choice that aligns with your values, you need to clarify your values. And if you've clarified your values, you have a responsibility now to exercise those values. That means you need to learn about those things and you need to make the right choices. And you can't absolve yourself of that responsibility. It's hard. And it is very easy. Marketers like me would be very keen to just kind of let you take the easy way out and just buy my thing and kind of make you feel better about that choice without doing too much research. But ultimately, though, we know, all marketers truly know, all salespeople truly know, that the path to sustainability is really helping you as the consumer make the most informed choice you can. If we fool you, we won't trust you anymore. And, it is important. So when people listening to this think like, okay, maybe I feel good about all this power that I have. All right, kick ass. I can go out there and kind of make some good choices. There is no costless trade-off. Your power comes with a lot of responsibility. And the first step is realizing what power you have. The second step is exercising it. And that's not easy. So I think my book's a great place to start, by the way, and kind of learning about your power, but it's not the second one. Like you have to make good choices. And all I would say is choose wisely.
You stole the words from my mouth. 100%. That's beautifully said. This might be controversial, but I think the victim card is a cop-out because it's easy to play the victim card because you don't want to put in the work. But, I said earlier, awareness leads to intentionality. Being informed about your decisions leads to better decisions. And I think it's important as consumers to put in the work to be aware and informed and identify our values and exercise that power. With great power comes great responsibility. I think that's a beautiful place to end this discussion. Jason, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This is one of the greatest conversations I've ever had the privilege of having in my entire life. If you guys want to buy his amazing book, Booze Babe and the Little Black Dress, it is going to be linked in the description below. Jason, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on. It's been really wonderful. Great questions.